Thank you, Sir Mark. During the Easter recess, the Georgia All-Party Parliamentary Group sent a delegation to Georgia, which I was pleased to be part of. I declare my related interest as set out in the Members' Register, and I'm also pleased to have this opportunity to discuss issues which arose from the visit, and also to thank the Speaker and MPs in Georgia, the Georgian Ambassador to London, Sophie Katsarava, who we are honoured to have here with us this afternoon, and also our Ambassador to Tbilisi, Mark Clayton, all of whom made this a very useful, fascinating visit, where we had meetings with the Prime Minister and with many other ministers, select committee chairs, opposition members, and civil society activists. And let me start with a general observation that I doubt that UK-Georgia relations have ever been so good as they are at the current time. Under the Wardrop dialogue, bilateral discussions have improved relations in the diplomatic and ministerial spheres. And I'm very pleased to report that parliamentary level relations are also excellent. At the same time, during our visit, we saw great potential for improved economic ties with our post-Brexit free trade agreement in place, and also cultural ties. For instance, with my honourable friend for rugby, going to visit the Georgian rugby headquarters on our visit. They're crazy for the sport, by the way. There is no doubt that Georgia is a country that faces west and wants to be part of the wider family of free and democratic countries with Western values and economies. It is a young democracy and has a somewhat politically polarised society, but united with huge polling majorities in their wish for membership of the European Union and also NATO. In fact, both aims have now been written into their constitution, and like with Ukraine, a formal EU membership application has now also been made. This builds on their existing EU accession agreement and their 3-month EU visa, which again they entered into at roughly the same time as Ukraine. In practice, the EU often looks at developments with these two countries together. Russia, before their 24th February wider invasion of Ukraine, occupied roughly 20% of both countries, and in practice runs the puppet regimes which they prop up in both, actually from the same Moscow office. Whenever President Putin warns against Ukraine membership of the EU and NATO, he usually also simultaneously warns against Georgian membership. So we can debate the rights and wrongs of the EU and Russia lumping Ukraine and Georgia together, but in practice we need to acknowledge that it happens to some degree. As far as NATO is concerned, both Ukraine and Georgia have been forming closer links over recent years. Georgia, for instance, provided a significant detachment to operations in Afghanistan. Our delegation took the opportunity to visit the NATO-Georgia Joint Training Evaluation Centre, which was set up after the Wales-NATO summit in 2014. Here, Georgia troops are trained in NATO tactics by NATO troops, and clearly the ground is being set for ever closer NATO compatibility, whatever the speed of Georgia's membership application may be. Of course, the threat presented by Russia hung over much of our delegation's meetings in one way or another. It is important to realise here that the intransigence, brutality and violence expressed by Russia under Putin did not start with Ukraine in 2014, rather it started with the Russian invasion of Georgia in 2008. As a result, to this day, some 20% of Georgia, namely Abkhazia and South Ossetia, is occupied by Russian troops, and Georgia supports some 250,000 IDPs from those regions. The pattern of Russia's use of disinformation and cyber warfare, its escalating use of agents provocateurs, special forces, and then devastating slash and burn techniques, all of this has consistently recurred where Russia has meddled. So we should be horrified and disgusted by Russian actions in Ukraine, but we should not be surprised. As with the occupied Donbass, post its occupation, Russia puts virtually no investment into these places other than garrisons, and they are effectively left to rot in a kind of limbo. Sukhumi, the capital of Abkhazia, and once the pearl of the Black Sea, is now an empty ghost town of tumbleweed. And Mariupol, need I say more? This is Russia's plan, namely to have weak, corrupt and malleable puppet states that it preferably doesn't have to pay for, to act as buffers on its borders. In the case of Georgia, every few weeks, Russia stages some farcical provocation action in the occupied territories of Abkhazia and South Ossetia, like moving the barbed wire fence forward a few metres, or closing crossing points, or arresting shepherds rounding up their sheep, always to stir the pot and maintain tension and leverage. And by the way, the United States calls these occupied territories. So could the Minister please explain why the UK government still refuses to do so? The year 2008, we should recall, was a difficult time with the global financial crisis. Standing up to Putin was not their number one priority in the West. Actually, the West, led by the US, refused to intervene on behalf of Georgia, whilst in the UK, Russian investment was being actively encouraged as one way of propping up our failing economy and banks. So in 2008, Putin received his first of numerous free passes from the West. And sensing the West's disinterest and lack of cohesion, onward he marched to Crimea and Donbass, let alone stamping out democracy within those countries directly in Russia's ambit, such as Chechnya, Belarusia, and Kazakhstan. Each time, more or less, he received his free pass. And during this time, the UK failed to arm Ukraine and also Georgia. Yes, we gave army training and other aid, but not guns. Of course, the UK did more than most other countries, and this should be recognised as much as our very significant contribution of weaponry post the recent war starting. But the question does need to be asked. Would Putin have attacked if Ukraine had received the means to fight back then as it has now? Would so many people, some 8,000 civilians so far, have been killed? Would such physical and cultural destruction as we have seen actually happened? And I make an observation here that both Ukraine and Georgia have been receiving high-level assistance from the UK to counter cyber warfare. Don't forget that the prediction in the first days of the February war was that Russia would wipe out Ukraine's infrastructure by use of cyber attacks. This has not happened, in the same way that frequent Russian cyber attacks on Georgia have also failed. We gave help on cyber before the war started, and it worked. So why did we not also do so with weapons? Surely we need to learn the lesson here, namely that prevention is better than cure. The US has provided the Javelin anti-tank system to Georgia, but we have not sent arms. Let's not make the same mistake again, and let's give Georgia the weapons they need. As regards Ukraine, Georgian public opinion is pro-Ukraine's fight for survival and liberty to an overwhelming extent. I think in Tbilisi, every third house that I saw flew the Ukrainian flag. And there were huge rallies held in support, and I understand that hundreds of Georgians have unofficially volunteered to fight in Ukraine. The Georgian government have been very vocal in their support for Ukraine. They have been supporting anti-Russian motions at the UN. They have sent a very significant amount of non-military aid to Ukraine and are hosting some 25,000 Ukrainian refugees. Georgia has not, however, adopted the Western sanctions directly, although indirectly, for instance in financial services, they are applying them. Georgian opposition parties and Ukraine have been demanding a tougher position on sanctions and military intervention. Against this is Georgia's proximity to and partial occupation by Russia, with a population of only 3.5 million and without the cover of being a NATO member. The pain of being left alone against Russia in 2008 remains raw with the Georgian governing party, and so the government treads carefully with Russia. This has resulted in varying degrees of friction with Ukraine, it has to be noted. In the same way, the recent arrival of some 30,000 Russians to Georgia is contentious. These tend to be young middle-class Russians who don't want to be involved with the war. They can live in Georgia for a year and set up businesses there. The practical, if not official, position taken by the Georgian government is that this is a welcome benefit to Georgia of the Russian brain drain. Opposition parties tend to be less charitable towards these Russians, and there can be tension in public when Russian is heard spoken. But recognising that this issue applies to huge numbers of Russians, another 200,000 for instance in Istanbul alone, I would be interested to hear what the Minister's view is on these fleeing Russians and whether we know how many there are in the UK. It's also important to note that the strategic issues for the UK and the West do go beyond Ukraine in terms of the wider Black Sea region, and these will need to be recognised. Subject to for instance, let me take the issue of possible Ukrainian neutrality, subject to a referendum, as has apparently been mooted by President Zelensky at the Istanbul peace talks. It may be that a heavily armed Swiss-type neutrality might work for a very large and populated country like Ukraine. But that is not the case for Georgia, which is small geographically and with a small population. Indeed, the ground taken by Russia on the first day of their February offensive was more than exists in the whole of Georgia. So Georgia's long-term security is considered by the Georgians to be effectively bound up in joining the NATO umbrella, not neutrality. If Ukraine were to go neutral, then Russia's attention would be drawn to Georgia, possibly with disastrous implications for Georgian security. It does seem that UK government security documents are slowly coming round to recognising the strategic importance of the wider Black Sea strategic balance. Although it has to be noted that the 2021 Integrated Review, Global Britain in a Competitive Age, mentions the Black Sea only once. This is a region where Britain conducts 21 billion worth of bilateral trade, making up 3% of our exports, which is significantly expanding. And I believe we still have the largest navy in Europe, of course. In April 2021, HMS Defender was deployed to challenge Russian illegal claims around Crimea and was very much welcomed in Ukraine and Georgia. And during the current war, we have started to provide Ukraine with our anti-ship missiles. Let us assume that Ukraine prevails in its war. How, I ask the Minister, are we going to get trade going again in the Black Sea? Will we help get rid of the mines? Will we work with Ukraine and Georgia, and importantly Turkey, to keep the lines open and uphold maritime law? What kind of post-war planning is going on? Let me state the obvious here. The Georgians, as with the Ukrainians, will always tell people that they don't want war and they don't want instability in their region. What they do want is recognition of their sovereignty, democratic freedom to embed themselves in the European family, to encourage free trade and improve the economic lot of their people. The sacrifices and sufferings of the Ukrainian people since 2014, as for Georgia since 2008, have been immense and totally unjustified. I hope that our ministers are looking at the clear pattern established by Russia and are learning the lessons of our earlier years of relative inaction, so we can now stop the rot coming out from Russia spreading further.